Hello everybody, and welcome to the Painting Paladin. My name is Justin, and today I'll be taking you guys through a step-by-step on how to paint the sword monk Q-Nooby by 1 gold piece. Now you can find 1 gold piece on my mini factory, or you can check out their Patreon. With that being said, let's head to our paint desk and get started, shall we? Alright, now before we begin, we undercoated this model with Zandri Dust spray by Citadel, and this gives us a nice starting point for the rest of our colors. So the first color we're going to use is Thondia Brown, and that's going to be just for the sword monk's robes. Now that the Thondia Brown is dry, we can move on to the next color, and that's going to be Rhinox Hide. Now we're going to use this to paint in his 2 belts, the neck collar piece, and the handle of the sword. Moving on to our next color, we're going to be using Lead Belcher. Now we're going to be using this to be painting in all the bits of chainmail on his torso and chest, as well as the belt buckle and the metal studs on the belts, as well as the sword's guard and pommel. Now you don't need to worry about the blade because we're going to be painting that a different color. Moving on to our next color, it's going to be Catachan Flesh. Now I'm using this to just blacken the boots, but if you wanted to use Rhinox Hide you could. It was just that in a lot of the reference pictures I looked at, his boots had a somewhat reddish tint to it, and I decided this was the best color to go with. Alright, so the next color we're going to be using is Zandri Dust. Now this is just going to be for his underrobes, and the reason we're adding this one is A, to fix up any of the mistakes that you might have made while painting the other colors, and B is so that to ensure a smooth even coat in case the spray had missed anything. Now remember, when applying this, just take your time so that you don't end up getting any paint on the rest of the stuff you've already painted. But if you do, you can always go back to your other colors and touch it up. Now that that's done, we can move on to the last of the colors for his clothes, and that's going to be Gorthor Brown. Now this is just going to be for the turtleneck that he's wearing, and it mainly only shows around the back of his head. So just take your time in painting this and try to avoid getting it on anything else. Alright, now that all the base colors of the clothes are finished, we can start moving on to washes. Now the first wash we're going to be using is Agrax Earthshade, and that's going to be applied all over the miniature. Now remember, when applying washes you need to watch out for pooling. Now this can lead to either real bad dark spots, or you can get clogged and lose detail. Now to get rid of pools, the best way to do it is to use the tip of your brush and just soak them back up. Now that the wash is dry, you can see it added a lot of definition to the model. However, it darkened everything down, so what we're going to do is we're going to build back up the layers. Now the first color that we're going to be using is actually a 50-50 mix of Zandri Dust and Ushabti Bone. When painting this, just make sure to paint all the raised areas and avoid the deeper recesses, and that'll make the wash stand out even more. Next, we're going to be using Thondia Brown again, and just like what we did with the previous color, we're only going to be painting the raised areas, avoiding those deeper recesses. And lastly, the next color that we're going to be using is Ironbreaker. Now for the chainmail, we're going to be applying this using a dry brushing technique. That is where you put paint on your paintbrush, wipe most of it off, and lightly go over the surface of the chainmail with it. Now with the buckles and the studs, you can apply those using the regular layering method. Now that all the layers have been built back up, we can move on to the next step of this project, and that's going to be all of his skin. Now for our first color, we're going to be using Bugman's Glow as our base foundation color. Now when applying this layer, make sure you really thin down your paint. You want it to flow smooth, and that way it doesn't dry out fast and get clumpy, otherwise you'll lose definition. Once the Bugman's Glow is dry, we can move on to our next color, and that's going to be Reikland Fleshshade. Now this is a wash, so we're going to be applying this all over the skin areas, letting it settle in the deepest recesses. Once the Reikland Fleshshade is dry, you can move on to your next color, and that's going to be Cadian Fleshtone. Now, just like with the Agrax Earthshade, you're only going to want to paint this down the raised areas, such as the nose, cheekbones, around the temples, tops of fingers, and things like that. So just take your time and work around the model with that. Alright, with that the skin's looking pretty good, so we can move on to our next thing, and we're going to be working on the magical blade of the sword. So the first color that we're going to be applying is Hoeth Blue as our base color here. Now that the Hoeth Blue is dry, we're going to move on to Baharroth Blue. Now we're only going to be painting this in the center, in the raised area there, so just take your time and work your way down the middle of the sword, and make sure not to get any of the edges, but if you do, you can go back to Hoeth Blue and touch them up. Alright, it's looking pretty good, but to really make it pop, the next color that we're going to be using is Ulthuan Gray, and we're just going to be painting a thin line of this right down the middle of the sword. We're also going to use this color to paint the tassel that's on the pommel of the sword as well. Okay, now that the sword's done, there's just one last thing that needs to be taken care of, and that is, of course, the sword monk's hair. So for our first color, we're going to be using Gray Seer as our base layer. So now that the Gray Seer is dry, the next color that we're going to be using is Apothecary White. Now this is a contrast paint and it works quite similar to the way a wash does. So we're just going to apply this all over and let it settle into the deepest recesses there. Alright, now that the Apothecary White is dry, the last thing we're going to do is just dry brush a little bit of Ulthuan Gray across the top of there just to really highlight his hair. Alright, with that last step finished, we are done painting the model himself. However, there's still one thing that needs to be done, and that is basing your model. Now, if he's part of a larger army, you're going to want to base him similar to the rest of your army. Or if you're using him in games such as D&D, you're going to want to base him according to your campaign. Alright, now that he's based, the Sword Monk is ready to take on the Empire. Now the big thing to remember is take your time, so that way you avoid any mistakes. But if you make a mistake, you can always go back and touch it up with your previous colors. With that being said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And if you want to stay up to date on future videos, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Thanks everyone!